welcome to the Monday, June 17th meeting of the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Commission. If we could get everyone to please give introduction and which subcommittee you are part of, please.
I'm Pierre Tong. I'm on the Bicycle Planning Committee.
Paul Neville, I'm on the Community Outreach Committee.
Dwight Otwell, I'm on the Bicycle Planning Committee.
Mary Sell, Bicycle Committee.
Susan Hatchell, Chair.
Rebecca Proudfoot, Community Outreach. And I'm Elizabeth Alley. I'm on the Pedestrian Committee.
I'm David Cox, Raleigh City Council.
Staff, you want to?
Fontaine Burris, City Staff.
Paul Black, City Staff.
Eric Lamb, City Staff.
Excellent. Thank you all. First thing on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. Have people had a chance to review those? Do anyone have any comments? Do we have a motion for approval?
I'll move to approve the minutes as written.
A second.
Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? We'll move on to the next item on our agenda, public comments. This is the opportunity for the public to come forth and tell us about their feelings about things and things that are not on the agenda. Please keep your comments to 3 minutes per speaker, but do come forward. Join us. Please give your name and your address.
Give me just a second to set up.
Okay.
They bring these huge hashes on here. I wanted to be able to share with you some things, but I wasn't sure how I'd get it to you. Well, we'll skip it. Maybe you've all heard of me a little bit anyway. I have a couple of comments that I wrote down just to help me get a little bit sad talking about it, so it's hard. So I want to say hi, I'm Susan. I reached out to you. My address is 921 Vestavia Woods Drive. I reached out to you a little while back, and I wanted to come and address the full committee and talk about this big event that's happened in my life. I wanted to first kind of establish that this is something I'm really passionate about. I was the 2014 Car for Bike Trader. I was 2015 recipient from the Triangle's Golden Spoke Award. I've been the marshal for the MS-150 and the ADA rides, and I really try to be an active cyclist. I commute to Durham from my home in North Raleigh as often as I can, and I coach a local mountain bike team. So I do this a lot, and I try to give that same sense of value on sustainability, health, and all of that to my kids. I have 3, and they're as beautiful as you might have gotten to see had I figured out that hash. So my oldest son has been riding like little rolling toys since he was a baby, and we finally took his training wheels off when he was 3. And then he did his first CNC ride when he was 7, and he about the start of his 6th grade year, 2 years ago, started riding his bike home from school. And I was kind of harsh about it. I was like, you can't do it by yourself until you've done it 21 times. And then 21 makes a habit, my mom tells me. And so then on the first time he did it alone, I drove in my car behind him and didn't tell him and didn't let anybody pass until he was into the neighborhood. So this is something that we've really well practiced, and that he's been and demonstrated to me that he's competent and capable of doing. So I trusted him, and for 2 years, this has been his favorite thing to do. He loves to ride his bike home from school. And so on the Monday of Bike to Work Week this year in May, I was hosting a ride back from Durham to Raleigh with my other new cyclists that had never done this before. And I got a call from a stranger who was telling me that my son had been in a crash, and I could hear him crying in the background. I didn't know what was going on. I'm trying to keep it all together, and I had a coworker pick up my kids, get to the hospital, and so Holden was crossing Strickland Road at the back of Bailiwick Park. Speed limit's about 45 miles an hour there. There are schools on either side of the Greenway. There's a school where he was coming from. He passes another school. 4 schools, like within a half mile of this spot. And the speed limit's 45. There was a truck parked at the exit to the Greenway, and this was apparently obstructed the view in some way. And so Holden says he went around the back of the truck. He stopped, waited for 4 cars to pass, and then crossed into the road. And he was struck in the second lane. He rolled on top of her car, and his head dimpled her windshield and shattered it twice. And he crushed the front of her car. His shoulder was shattered, and his leg was broken in several places, and his helmet really saved his life. The police defended the person driving the car. She said that she couldn't have seen him, and that my son's injuries weren't really severe enough to have warranted any kind of measuring or attention. They said this spot wasn't a pedestrian crossing, and that my son may have just made a mistake in judgment. So I'm sure that insurance will figure all that out, and insurance and companies and attorneys, but that's now our life. Like, my son's in a wheelchair. It's changed us upside down for the past month at least, and who knows how much longer. So I decided to come talk to you tonight, and I wanted to address specifically the intersection where he was struck, but also the nature of the way they were struck. Where he comes out, Holden crosses the road to a ramp on the other side that's access to the sidewalk, and there's no pavement marking, there's no lights and flashing signs like you might see in other Greenway areas. And I started thinking to myself, reflecting over the police officer's words, that it was a roadway, that this is intended for cars to be on. But the ramps on both sides and the exit to the Greenway clearly just say, hey, come on over. So I've driven around, found maybe 7 or 10 other places where we have Greenway crossings with a ramp on the other side. It's a regular way that we cross. We don't stripe it well. This particular intersection of Bailiwick and Strickland, or the Bailiwick Greenway extension and Strickland, is of most interest to me, but it's not uncommon either. So what I'm asking of you, what I hope that you'll continue to do, is act on behalf of these vulnerable road users like my child, but also to really wrap up that project. Things like communicating and calling out to DOT, hey, this is your road, this is our Greenway, we need to finish this. This isn't safe for pedestrian users. There were other people watching the event, so it is commonly used if there just happen to be people out there. And we want that, and we want to encourage that, but we don't want, hurt little kids coming home from school. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This incident did have, when we were going to get to our comments, at the end of the comments, we did have a lot of emails going around about this one as well, because you had contacted us. And I think some folks did look into that location, and Dwight, you reached out to our police officer, but you've not heard back?
So yeah, I contacted the crash investigation unit to ask what the criteria were for triggering a investigation that would get the measurements and stuff, and I haven't heard back yet, so I'll follow up soon.
Okay. Yeah, I think, looking at that specific intersection would be important, but also I think several of us on the commission have had conversations about how bicycle and pedestrian crashes are investigated. So that'll be something we continue to do. Are there other public comments? Please come forward.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Mary Jo Gallenbeck. I live on Creston Road in Raleigh. in walking distance to the 5 Points intersection on Glenwood Avenue, Whitaker Mill, Fairview Road. I wanted to share feedback and concern regarding the install of the blinking yellow left turn light, that it has caused drivers to enter into the intersection and attempt to cut off the cars that are driving forward. And often a pedestrian will be in the crosswalks. Let's say they are turning left off of Whitaker Mill to travel south on Glenwood Avenue. And they have only two choices. One is to either speed up and the pedestrian's there in the crosswalk, or to stop right in the middle of the intersection with Fairview Road, which has the right-of-way to go straight across through the intersection and continue on Whitaker Mill. I believe those lights were installed about 12 months ago, maybe 18, when they installed the new traffic lights. And I am a walker. I'm a mass transit user. And so I visit that intersection almost on a daily basis, if not more than twice. And consistently, this is the behavior I'm seeing with the motorists. Prior to that, the intersection had left on green arrow only, which gave a safe distance between managing pedestrians crossing the street and then having the cars have access to turn left when they could. So I am requesting that that intersection be reviewed again, that it is unsafe for pedestrians. In addition to the blinking light causing it more dangerous, I'd also like to request that the pedestrian sign be illuminated for the pedestrians to cross with each green light. It is only activated when the button is pushed. And so if the pedestrian doesn't know about that law, they'll sit and wait for the pedestrian symbol to show up. And that creates an anxiousness in the pedestrians who want to cross their street. So if the pedestrian light was always illuminated, then you would have pedestrians crossing, knowing that it's safe to go, and there would be less confusion for that area. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have otherwise.
No, that's my hood as well, and
Okay? All right, thank you.
thanks so much. Did you have something to add, Paul?
I just want to clarify the Whitaker Mill traffic going straight, not turning, actually extends onto Fairview. Whitaker Mill ends at that point, right? Mm-hmm. So it is. I just wanted clarification when you're talking about Whitaker Mill south to Glenwood. If they're continuing straight across the intersection, are they headed to Fairview on the other side?
So they're
East
off
side?
of they're entering the
Side.
intersection from Whitaker Mill. They're turning left onto Glenwood,
South.
traveling south.
Okay.
Otherwise, if they were to go straight, they'd go into Fairview. And the same is applied when somebody is turning, they're traveling on Glenwood, traveling north, they hit the intersection, they want to make a left onto Fairview Road. The blinking light enables the driver to proceed. This is a very dangerous area to even see oncoming traffic traveling south on Glenwood Avenue. So it creates, again, another urgency. Cars speed up, pedestrians in the crosswalk. They don't know that this left turn is going to happen. So it has worsened the situation by adding the blinking yellow.
I would say that the problem is people, yours on Whitaker Mill I've not encountered. It's the Glenwood people turning onto Fairview with that flashing yellow.
Yeah, that is actually just another one. The Whitaker Mill one is the one that's actually the most dangerous since the blinking light has been added. Prior to that, there was no blinking light, and so drivers were a little unfamiliar with the intersection, and they approached it quite cautiously, slowly. But now that the blinking light has been introduced, that's not the pattern of behavior I'm seeing.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, goodness, other public comments. Well, hello.
Hello. I'm Jonathan. I live on 1201 Trillium Circle, Apartment B in Raleigh. And I'm a member of Oaks and Spokes. So I guess the one major point that I would like to make today is currently we're in the process of the downtown transportation plan, which is heavily tied to the BRT plan. And talking to city staff, it seems to me that the bicycle portion of the downtown plan is not it's not funded, doesn't have a schedule. It's sort of like if we're going to put in a BRT lane, we'll put in the bike lane if it's on the plan. But I believe that for us to truly have a multimodal downtown, we need a great bicycle network. And this would allow the buses to be more effective, as people can take the bus to the bike and then use bikes. There's the new ride share, like the Citric cycles, right at the bus station in downtown Raleigh. And this would allow someone that's not as comfortable on a bike, biking in traffic, which you pretty much have to do downtown. There's no other way to get around, to be able to get to within a block or two of their location on protected infrastructure. So I think that you should really recommend that we should fund this, we should have a schedule for this, and it should be implemented at the same time as the BRT. So I have a couple other questions. One, there's a bicycle count stations all around Raleigh, and I was wondering if it was possible to get those counts publicly available on a live basis. I think that would be really cool. You could do fun stuff with that data. Also, I've seen a lot of plans for multi-use paths as bicycle infrastructure on higher speed roads, which I'm really liking, like the Pool Road widening, I guess. They're putting in I think a 12-foot multi-use path on the side. The one thing I'm concerned about is the crossing. Is there any plans to make it more visible to cars that there is a bicycle crossing here and people might be biking with higher speeds, such as like a green paint on the ground, something to give like a visual signal to cars so that they know, especially if they're going through that intersection again and again, that they need to be careful for that. Because I guess my concern is someone's biking along, someone's making like a left turn into it. They're not really looking for a bike coming at 15 miles an hour or so, and there could be a collision there. So I guess that's everything I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Powell.
Thank you very much.
Can staff comment on the question about statistics on the samples?
For the bike counters?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we don't even have access to the live feeds at this point. They're actually being run, they were installed by the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. There are also some on the greenways that are run by Parks and Recreation, and they're all run through third-party vendor. There's a fair amount of data scrubbing that goes on. We get them on a quarterly basis, and it's usually about a month or so delay so that they can scrub the data and look for any irregularities. An example that we have is our counter that's on Hillsborough Street in the bike lane. There's on-street parking adjacent to it, and we're finding that cars pulling out of the parking spaces are triggering the counters, and so we're looking at ways to sort of fix the data. And so for that particular station, we are holding back, or the vendor, ITRI, is holding back the data at this point. But for the other counts, we've actually gotten our first quarter's worth of data, and I don't know if it's publicly available, but we can certainly make it available if somebody's interested.
Can you remind us of all the locations that you can remember that those were put down in?
Well, again, they were from Campo, but I drive over a number of them. I know that there are two on the Neuse River Greenway. One is a Campo counter, one is a Parks and Rec counter. There's one on the north shore of Lake Johnson that's a Parks and Rec counter. There's one at Pullen Park on Rocky Branch. There's another one on Rocky Branch as you enter Boylan Heights. There's the one on Hillsborough Street, which is in front of, I guess it's the old Velvet Cloak. It's in that vicinity near the YMCA. There's one on Ridge Road in front of the middle school. And is there one at Walnut Creek Wetland Center? Okay, I think. There may be some more. Those are the ones I can recall right off the top of my head.
And
I
you
don't
said
know the Parks and Rec system as well. I only know a few that I see on a regular basis.
Hillsborough in front of the old Velvet Cloak. Is that what you said, right?
Yeah.
Not across street. Okay, thanks.
Will we be getting an update of this data at some point?
Certainly, if you'd like.
Well, that would make it public, is my point. Not only would we love to hear it, but it would also make it public at that point.
That's the goal. This is a nascent program that ITRI has been coordinating, and they're building a statewide database of count locations for bike and ped. So we're really excited this is finally taking place, and we'll be happy to share that when it's available.
Good. Thank you so much. Other public comment?
Hello, this is Adam Haller, 4504 Pitt Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. You guys know me. We're on the same page. I'm on your side of the fence. I believe in everything you're doing. The first speaker prompted me to speak. I wasn't going to. I stand in solidarity. That's my worst nightmare. What happened to her? Happened to one of my kids. Coming here for years and talking about bike infrastructure. Now, I arrived here with a little bit of anger. Riding here from North Hills, I was almost physically, violently attacked by 3 drivers. I counted each incident. I was following every single traffic rule perfectly clear. And 3 drivers had the audacity to cut into my space, cut me off, and try to run me off the road. And this is on a place on Lassiter Mill and St. Mary's that have bike lanes and sharrows that this commission has designed and approved. Now, I'm even more outraged after hearing that the police investigation is not going full speed ahead on this case where there's a child that's been physically permanently changed. That's outrageous. You guys should be as upset as I am now. So I've went from sadness to anger and back. If this child were to be injured in a commercial aviation incident or in a city bus or in other conveyances, there would be the NTSB here with multiple agencies at all levels of state government investigating what happened. And our local police say, the kid was at fault. I don't want to accept that, and I hope you don't either. I think that this group should make a motion to demand that the local police elevate this investigation to find out all the details of the crash, whether it was the road, the driver's actions, the child's actions, a full investigative report. And if they're not willing to do it, the state should step in with their oversight agency, whoever's in charge of that group, to demand such an investigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Other public comment? Well, thank you all for showing up this evening and for bringing us these issues, because we do consider all of them to be quite serious. And I think Dwight and I have been talking about the officer and trying to get more information about that whole process for future updates. So we are certainly trying to get to some information about that particular case and the amount of investigation that does or does not occur for various types of accidents, and just so that we understand how this crash data works. So that is something we want to look at. Anything else? We'll move on to the staff reports, beginning with council updates.
Thank you. And the one thing to share with City Council is the commission is now fully seated. The City Council appointed Nick Neptune at their last council meeting, and so you now have back to 10 members, and you'll need to reshuffle the committee assignments to balance everything out. So.
Yes, and I wanted to ask, when do we have elections? I'm not sure. I would reshuffle. I might leave that to our next chair, but
elections are in August.
Yeah, elections are coming up, so I might just find a place for Nick as well, and then we'll do the reshuffling when we have an election. But since it's so close, it's just 2 months away. I believe there is an opening on community outreach. You are short a member. So when I speak with Nick, perhaps I'll just suggest to him that he hold that seat for 2 months, at which point everybody can shuffle the cards and we'll see who our new chair is, and we'll move on with a new leadership. We've had so many changes under my time as chair that I really don't want to ask people to take a position for a month or 2. We'll let that wait. But in the meantime, we're very excited to have Nick. We have 4 fairly new members, so it's great to finally be back and have everybody here. And I think it really will help our committee work quite a bit. I mean, not only the full commission, but the committee work, which is important ways we get things done. So I look forward to that. Anything else with council?
I don't believe so.
How about a bike share update?
Bike share, Fontaine, would you like to give us a breakdown?
Sure. So in regard to the remaining 10 stations, which I'm sure is what you're most curious about, we are in the permit review process for those remaining stations. As soon as we clear that process, we have the green light to go forward and get those installed. That does include a handful of stations, or all the stations that include concrete pads. So those stations do require a little more work and time because the concrete has to cure, but we're hoping we get through this week and can begin work next week. So you guys will be seeing new stations coming online shortly. We are up to 14,800, so almost 15,000 miles traveled since we launched the station. In May, we added 793 new members. The app remains our most popular way of people signing up. 611 of those people signed up through the app, and then the remaining were between the kiosk and the website. So the app is really the most popular way that people are accessing the bikes. We have a little over 200 bikes on the ground now operating, and people seem to be happy, and we continue to get good feedback with the system.
Can I ask a question?
You may.
Do we know what the average mileage of a trip is?
Yes. At least for this month, it was actually a flat 2-mile average.
2 miles. Great. Thanks.
Excellent. It really is doing that last mile.
And between everyone that rode this month, it's 572,000 calories burned.
Oh, that's even better.
In case anyone's curious.
I'll have to ride a little more, I guess. Any other questions for Fontaine about bike share? So we should be fully implemented soon.
So 2 things as far as our horizon associated with bike share. We're pushing hard to finish the phase 1, knowing that there is a phase 2 that we will start to begin development on. And then we are also going to look at developing some policy guidance for new development. We've actually had a few different developers reach out to us and say, hey, we're interested in adding this in as part of our infrastructure with our new development in the area. And so we're going to develop some guidelines and policies associated with that, so we can look at how to responsibly react to some of those situations and be opportunistic and continue to expand the system.
Excellent. Very good. We'll move on to Bike Month Review. So it's now June. We don't have to anticipate it anymore. Is someone going to give us an update of how things went?
It was largely very successful. I'll turn some of it over to Fontaine, but we pulled off quite a number of events. We had the largest amount of pit stops on Bike to Work Day that we've ever had. We also went and did some PM stops that for the first time. And those were relatively successful for the first time around. I think they'll be even more successful next time. We'll have a little more time to do the publicity. Working with some of our partners like Oaks and Spokes and some of the bicycle clubs around the region, we partnered with them for a number of events. The turnout was good. I think the only one that we ended up pulling back a little bit on was there was one that was originally going to be a family ride to Dorothea Dix for a picnic, and the picnic became an adult Easter egg hunt that was probably not suited for the younger ages from the description.
Dick's Barn.
It was building off of an event that Parks and Rec was hosting. So they originally were hosting a family picnic in the park. They over time changed it to a 21 and up event. So there wasn't much for our ride to.
Well, good effort. Anything else on Bike Month Review?
Yeah, we're still working on developing some of the final statistics, but I can bring that to the next BPAC meeting
Okay.
and put that in the packet. if
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
all
it's
right.
always good to do some Monday morning quarterbacking and determine what we could do better for next year. So we look forward to hearing more about that. Project updates.
Be happy to answer any questions about any specific projects we have in the pipeline currently.
Well, I saw, I think that there was a for council that you guys had prepared some on like Gorman and a few other that I think Oaks and Spokes had asked for some clarification, and I saw some bulleted out for different timeline and implementation that was going to be proposed, because that would be my normal questions like Gorman, blunt person, but I saw that bulleted in an email, I think in response to public comment. I mean, you're giving me a confused look.
There is a speaker from Oaks and Spokes that is on tomorrow's city
Okay.
council agenda.
So perhaps
did a backup report
was
to
prepared
address
for
the
that.
items that
Sure.
they were asking about.
So would that just be y'all's update probably, right? As far as timeline, I think I saw August 2019 was for Gorman Street, is that? Yeah.
Yeah, we're up against a federal deadline for some of that.
Mhm.
There's a federal rescission that's pending, and we need to have the projects obligated for construction. So they might not be under construction, but the money will be spoken for and all the approvals in place.
Okay.
Anything else about project updates?
Question about Buck Jones. I think you announced at one of the previous BPAC meetings that it was completed. So that work is done. I think it includes at least two traffic circles and bike lanes and restricted lane use, and that goes down in southwest Raleigh, borders Cary, down towards Crossroads. Have there been any feedback on that? It's radically different than what that area had seen before. It's an unusual place for traffic circles. I liked it because there's a good sight lines and visuals, but I just wonder how the traffic in that part of the city has responded.
Very well. I've had no complaints. I'm not aware of any issues from our traffic engineering staff. Roundabouts as an intersection treatment are very effective in those types of situations and have not had any problems or any damage that I'm aware of. One of the best things about that project was the ability for us to be able to add the sidewalks and the transit integration combined with the location of the pedestrian crossings associated with the project. So we're really happy with that turned out.
My comments are based on the fact that this is a primarily residential, almost totally apartment type area, which is a different demographic than we've put these projects in before.
Yeah, we're hopeful at some point that the town of Cary will reciprocate the cross-section on their side of the fence where it's 5 lanes south of I-40. We certainly believe there's opportunity there, but that's not our jurisdiction.
One quick question. When will the Mo-Bernie traffic calming be complete? Is that y'all's department or who
It's our
is?
engineering department that's constructing it right now, so I don't know what the completion date is.
Just curious.
Got to be close.
It's
all open.
Right. I know that it seems to be moving along. I was just curious. Probably soon.
Eric, would you mind, I know the city budget passed recently, giving us a brief update on kind of major projects that were funded?
Yeah, so a lot of what's in the current capital improvement program mirrors the continued implementation of the transportation bond program from 2017. So with the projects that were, I'm trying to remember in terms of any specific new projects that were funded, most of the projects have already been pipelined and have already received some level of funding from the previous year.
I saw the automotive Old Lewisburg, Atlantic, Wake Forest.
So that's Blunt Person Phase 2. So
Dysfunction Junction.
Yeah. Phase 1 has been put out for bid. I can't remember if the bid's been, I think the bid has been awarded on that project. So we're moving forward for construction on that. That's going to restripe Wake Forest Road. The Phase 2 project starts to get into the two-way conversions of portions of Blunt and Person. And the big capital lifts on that one is there's going to be a new roundabout at the intersection with Delway and a roundabout at the Circus.
Might help you get across Capitol Boulevard if you're not a motorist.
Correct.
That's great. Awesome.
So that project was funded through part of the CIP, and that we are negotiating the contract for design right now.
Wonderful.
Eric, I was wondering, now that you're fully staffed again, if we could set a schedule for the project update spreadsheet thing, maybe if we could get that quarterly or maybe twice a year or something like that, because I think that is a great way. I mean, I don't want to create paperwork for you guys that you don't need to do, but that's a great way to kind of everybody take the pulse and sort of see where we are on these projects. And I know it's been a struggle with lots of things going on and not all the time having enough staff.
I was fully staffed for 2 weeks, and then we lost one of our transportation planners who's responsible for doing our streetscape development.
I see.
So
He's breaking it to you softly.
Okay, he's breaking it to me.
but yes, that's our goal, is to provide that list to you on a regular basis.
Yes. Well, I don't think we need it monthly necessarily. I think that's a little excessive. But does the commission agree? Maybe if we could get it quarterly or something of that nature. I think that would be a great way to. And plus, we don't need to waste a lot of paper on it. But it would be good to get that reinstated a bit. Be helpful.
Can do.
Perfect. Anything else on project updates? If not, we'll move on to committee and member reports. The first is mine. I have nothing to report. No, no. Actually, the things I was going to mention was we do have a full commission for the first time since I've been chair. Hallelujah. We'll look forward to seeing Nick soon. The other was bringing up the elections and reminding everybody that as much as I am sad to leave, be thinking about who you would like to be stepping into the chair and the vice chair positions in the next couple months. And then also, I think the outstanding issues, things, and I think that's something maybe that, the leadership group can talk about, and, when things go to council or when things kind of go to staff, of how we get back into those. So I think that's one of the things I'd like to make sure I'm closing up here in the next couple months, as my term as chair will be coming to pass. But other than that, I've been on vacation most of June. I've been around town. So in the 2 weeks that I was gone, though, traffic appears to have gotten worse. The amount of roads that are impassable, the construction around town, it just seems like it's gridlock everywhere. So I'm just happy to be back. I'll move on to the Bicycle Planning Committee. Dwight, you want to give an update about what you guys have been up to?
Sure thing. We have a 2-lane UDO section to present and discuss and make a decision as a commission. So
Perfect.
Did we have a chance to get the PDF loaded, or is that going to be possible for us to get on the screen, do we think? Yay. All right, so the background is that we have previously sent a set of recommendations to update UDO street sections, mostly the bigger avenues and roads. And we got feedback back from staff who had got back to Paul saying, hey, we're putting together some 2-lane sections here and there, and we need, if you're going to have updated bike sections, we need to have that from you soon. So we had a specific request to develop a 2-lane separated bicycle option. We've gone through a bunch of different iterations, and we can go over these recommendations shortly. There is some discussion to be had about context. That one of the previous, when this was in the ad hoc committee, Elizabeth had some questions about how this is going to be applied and what the options are for when the context is not correct. So we'll get into that stuff, but first we'll go over these street sections. So these will apply to all different manner of 2-lane roads, from regular separated by paint to separated by median. We don't have any parking on these sections. This one does not include parking. And each section also includes a regular section and a NCDOT street section. So we have a preferred section, but when it's an NCDOT road, we have to use their standards, and we have slightly different sections. So a couple notes for all of these sections. Most of them add no extra right-of-way requirement when we're applying this. So the requirement on the developers would be the same as if these facilities were not separated. There are a couple of the sections that add 2 feet. I believe that's the biggest add that we have for this.
2 to 3, I think.
2 to 3. We might have a 3-foot on this one.
There's 1 3.
3-foot.
Yeah.
There's a chart at the very end that will help with this. So we're not adding a ton of street section. We are not adding any impervious surface. We're not adding any cost to the city. We can increase the right-of-way, and it'll actually decrease the pervious surface percentage for that section. So you'll have less pervious surface per acre in a linear fashion going down the road. We have some current projects in design that these were developed with in mind, such as Pool Road to the south. St. Albans is getting widened. I don't know if that's going to be before these have a chance to take effect, but it would be a similar kind of street section. That's when Elizabeth brought up the point that these might look great out in suburbia and in some of our more recent suburbs. In some of the older suburbs like Oakwood and on Glasscock in particular, perhaps Millburnie, some of these street sections might not be appropriate because these street sections are applied upon redevelopment. And if we have historic structures mixed in with a bunch of late stage development, I'm a forester, so when I think about like iterations of like you get something that's like final stage, right? Like you're closer to your final stage there in those neighborhoods, and so you're likely to get not as much redevelopment. The redevelopment that occurs is likely to be single home or small. It's going to be less large tracts of land that are getting developed at once. So how do we make this context sensitive? In the past, our answer has been, well, you can get a variance because staff has the ability to say, you know what, that really doesn't work there. You don't want to have your, like 100 foot of separated bike lane end in a brick wall on each side. And we'll do something else here in staff. But the city is changing these policies in the way that they do these variances. And this is becoming a much more onerous process. So our concern that we had in the committee was how do we account for the different needs of the different contexts and allow for the flexibility that's needed, and what does our final vision look like for these streets if we're trying to carve a bike lane out of a redevelopment process. And we had a lot of back and forth on this, and the Bicycle Planning Committee came down on I think that we can sum up the whole of our conversation is we recognize these as being problems, and we think that it continues to deserve the direct attention of the Bicycle Planning Committee, and we want to develop more context, but we think this is better than what we have. And so we would recommend taking the symmetrical, if you'll notice there's one option for each different kind here, there's symmetrical and a two-way cycle track. Our committee voted to recommend the one-way cycle track implementation of this street section.
I don't think the cycle track is the right word that you were saying.
Cycle
that.
path, two-way cycle path, not a cycle track. Yes, the one on top with one little guy going in each direction, one little non-gender person going in each direction.
So kind of like options 2 and 4.
2 and 4, yes. So that was our recommendation. I think that we need to have a discussion about context and how this is going to be applied and what we're going to be doing next.
Well, I'm just very excited to see that there are pedestrians, there's bicycles, and there's trees. So it's a win-win-win if you ask me. And frankly, I think it's great that we can do this in the same width right away, if not a very minor amount. And I would say that small increase of 2 to 3 feet is well worth making sure that the trees and the bicycles and the pedestrians are all being served.
And just really quickly, the ones that we're recommending, the biggest right-of-way is 1 foot increase, and all the rest maintain 0 increase in right-of-way. Oh, I'm sorry, I guess the NCDOT configuration does add 3. So.
Yeah. Well, at the it's one cross-section adds 3 feet, the others are 1 or 2.
Right.
And most of them are 0.
Right.
So I think that this is a really fine solution that accommodates pedestrian and bicycle safety, as well as the opportunity to have shade trees and a pleasant streetscape.
So these all 11-foot lanes?
Predominantly, yes.
Read 'em, I'm sorry.
The functional outcome from this is that the physical street footprint is going to narrow, that we're taking the space that's allocated for bike lanes today and putting it behind the curb.
Right.
So what this will effectively do is a lot more of these 2-lane avenues will look a lot more like St. Mary's Street at its narrowest sections. And so there'll be no on-street parking, no bike facilities between the curbs, and then the bike facilities will be located behind the curbs. So that's a fairly significant change. But from a cost perspective, as we're talking about doing this from a development, it actually lowers the cost of the street improvement, because you're not building full depth pavement for the bike lanes the way you would for as if they were in the street as travel
Exactly.
lanes. So there's some
That's
advantages here.
actually mind-blowing to me that it is a lower cost and a premier facility. And that we hadn't, it's so good that we could potentially approach it this way now. But if it's a cost savings, what a win. We also wanted to make sure, all the concerns that you brought up, Elizabeth, that we were really thoroughly addressing them and kind of understanding. Like, certainly this would never apply to a single-family home modification. A lot of retrofits would never have this come into play. And so for our own edification as a committee, we also wanted to understand what types of things would trigger these types of outcomes. And,
Sure.
you know,
I mean, in our conversation in ad hoc, I arrived at the same conclusion that you did, is that these are better than what we have now, but I think my concern remains, and it remains really on all these sections, is how do you make this both context sensitive, so from an urban design perspective, and continuous from a multimodal perspective.
right.
Well, and in terms of, when you're talking about context, I mean, if this assumes there's no existing vegetation. Like, as you mentioned, no historic properties, no historic trees, no, I mean, there's no topography, right?
There's no on-street parking.
It's just perfect world.
Isn't it a
These are
perfect?
brand new streets. Right?
These are brand new streets, and
Right.
so that we love them.
Right.
They may not always.
And the reason that I brought this up on the 2-lane sections versus the other ones is because the 2-lane sections cover a wide range of Raleigh, like we talked about at our previous meeting, many of them radiating from our historic core, where speeds are low, where on-street parking is necessary, where context sensitivity is really important.
And none of these would apply within our downtown, like,
Well, no,
Christmas
outside
plan
of the core
grid.
of the Christmas plan, right?
Mhm.
So 1 block east of the Christmas plan, which is
Mhm.
equally historic and unprotected, these would apply.
So that
What-
leads, go ahead, Mary.
I'm just trying to understand, I think that the Glasscock intersection was brought up, and that, where like the little restaurant is now.
Side, yeah.
So that rehabilitation, did that trigger sidewalk modifications? That was just part of the traffic calming from
When
the
that building
city?
was constructed, it triggered sidewalk modifications, which was pre-UDO.
Okay. So,
But this would be, I mean, I'll put on a different hat. This would be
right,
for subdivisions and not for single-family homes, but subdivisions, new construction, sometimes changes of use for commercial structures.
mhm,
So, I mean, this
Right.
is a broader challenge, but this
Sure.
one I think has potential to have much more impact, unintended consequences.
right. Yeah. So we're just interested in seeing a way to start to, but our biggest concern was as we are taking on a lot of projects where we are doing significant road widenings, which has an adverse implication for pedestrian and bicycling activity, trying to make sure that we're providing a premier protected safe facility as we implement those projects. And this is an opportunity to do that. And then I guess if we continue to iteratively think through how this would interface in other capacities and making sure that we're, because I can tell you at that Glasscock intersection, which my parents live a mile away from me, I can never take Glasscock because there's no bicycle facilities. That's how I'd get to my parents' house on our bike, and we have to take a 3-mile route to get to my parents' house because there were no bike facilities built on Glasscock. And something like this at that corner would just provide me a short buffer where I had, like a buffered intersection from a vehicle if that example we're citing of that project was used. And instead, we have like bulb outs and no bicycle infrastructure. So I'm eager to see implementation and strategies that corridor is now lost for bicycle activity. And we can't allow that to happen, I think, if we want to encourage multimodal activity and connectivity.
So I was going to ask the question a different way. If these recommendations are approved by the commission, they go to city as part of a recommended UDO change. Is that correct? Okay, once,
Be as part of the street design manual, which feeds into the UDO.
okay, and so this becomes a recommendation to city council to make these changes into our UDO, our universal plan.
Ultimately, right now, since the door is open and staff is reworking the street design manual,
Right.
we're going to take it in through that channel, and then we'll bring back what the drafts are that you can see and compare against. And ultimately, we'll take the street design manual forward to the city council and indicate the commission's endorsement of the cross sections.
Right. So if and when all that happens, then this gives blueprints and recommendations for projects coming forward for all sorts of purposes. It's not intended to be end-all, be-all, every street. This is just guidance to the design as we fit these requirements into the appropriate streets.
The challenge that I am bringing up, and apples to apples, I do support these, so I'm going to vote for them, but I just feel compelled to bring this up. This carries the force of law once it's adopted. There's no guidance. You build this or you get a variance.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. That is important.
So how have other communities approached this? A lot of communities are implementing above curb facilities. It's becoming a standard and a norm. So I'm sure that this friction or these types of issues are not, as far as built environment and adapting it to suddenly incorporate all modes in a way that's safe for all modes. So
Remember, there's a difference between retrofitting existing facilities, which is what basically everybody else is doing, versus inculcating these types of standards into your development requirements. And as far as we're aware, nobody has done this. There's no examples out there anywhere of people that are building in cycle tracks and buffered bike lanes into development standards. And so this is pretty.
but then they have a separate funding and implementation strategy in order to do that via the city as a vehicle.
Correct, as do we.
So I guess pinpoint where we have funds that can pay for above curb protective facilities on a broad level.
Which is what we're doing for Gorman Street and for all these other projects we have in the pipeline.
But it's not as, if this is to be done on a full, broad scale, we may need to enhance those funding structures to see broad-based implementation, I would argue. I ain't got nothing.
Sorry. So it is the intention of our planning committee to have the commission vote on this tonight, and we are recommending approval of the two-way cycle path for all these applications for both the regular and street and NCDOT street options. Is there anything that we can add to the motion to approve these, Elizabeth, that you think would help?
Well, Mr. Rotwell, if I can, I need some clarification because there are 3 pages of cross-sections.
Which ones?
Which ones, yes.
Oh, well, there's like all the different street types. So we have 2-lane divided, right? Let's list them out. We have 2-lane divided. 2-lane divided, 80-foot avenue, right? 2-lane divided.
Okay.
And 2-lane, which is center turn lane.
So the top is the current for 3 different ones, if that's helpful. So this is current,
Yeah.
and then your top 2 are your NCDOT configurations, and your bottom 2 are your city configurations. So if you look at the very top, that's the current.
So we're looking at 3 different road types here.
So we're looking at divided right now?
Okay, last page.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I was just saying, if it, to help as a point of reference, the very top one is your current for each one. And then your top 2 configurations options are your DOT, and then your bottom 2 are your city.
Each page is a different road type. So you have a 80-foot divided, a center turn lane divided, and a 64-foot undivided 2-lane road. 3 different road types.
Okay.
And for each one, we have the current shown at the top, and then you have 2 different options for each, the regular type of street and the city and the NCDOT street.
And we're proposing the first 2 of each of those. So if you're looking down on each piece of paper, we're suggesting option 2, which is your first NCDOT configuration, and option 4, which on the undivided reads 2-lane undivided avenue, 64-foot right-of-way, city street.
Okay. The ones that have a facility on each side of
That's
the
right.
street. Great.
So on
And
each
just
page,
for
it
those just
is,
playing along at home,
right?
that one and that one, correct?
Right.
Okay, thank you. And that's the same on each page?
It's mirroring the same type of facility on each, yeah.
Okay.
So one thing that came up in our subcommittee meeting was if you had a minimum length requirement, Elizabeth, that might start to address like a larger tract where it might feel like it's more intentional and not as ad hoc. So that could be one way. And then you could also have this baked into all the road projects via the transportation bond. But that might better address like a one-off. Yeah, I feel like the one-off developments that would trigger something like this, I would really be interested in understanding that more as far as what type of developments actually would trigger this type of improvement, because it certainly wouldn't be any single-family home isn't building a new sidewalk
That's
to.
right. So single-family homes are exempt from these types of development requirements.
Individual
single-family
Right.
homes. But the issue isn't the type of development, because it's really what is the street classification as it's called out in the city's comprehensive plan. So at that point, single-family exempted, any development triggers this type of construction requirement.
Right. Single-family exempted.
Yes.
So that's
An
already.
individual tear down? No.
Right.
You buy a church on Mill Burney that's torn down and you're going to make a new subdivision of 10 single-family homes?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
Sure. But that would be, I mean, more contextually appropriate, I would feel like, if it's a larger tract of land.
Potentially. But this can also be a single building that is doing a change of use
Mm-hmm.
on
And
West
so
Street, for example.
The reality is, for something like a Glasscock, you brought up the shops at Brookside, really the standard that would apply to the road is already in excess of the standards that you've shown here in terms of street width for the street and the cycling facilities. So really, it's really about securing the right-of-way dedication in those types of cases, and then we'd have to come back in for some type of comprehensive retrofit of the street. But in the new developing areas of the city, and there's still plenty of areas left that are proposed to be developed,
Right.
that have these 2-lane and 3-lane streets, as those areas develop with new development, they'd all be required to build these sections.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, that was when we were trying to address those smaller tracts of land, like if you had a foot minimum that would trigger this, or, because we're trying to do this in a way that it's not just going to be, we want it to be the intention of it to come
Yeah.
forward.
I agree with these sections. I think that, from a bicycle and pedestrian standpoint, they are superior to the ones in the code right now. I think having the kind of vertical separation, while it is good for a cyclist, It makes it more challenging for the transition, the kind of interim transition or non-interim transition. But I think that is maybe outside of our scope for right now, but maybe can be addressed when staff brings this back to us as part of the overall street handbook.
That was one of our biggest issues when we first started the whole process of looking at these street sections. This is great, but what happens at the intersection when this just ends? Does it just
Or
end?
mid-block.
Yeah, or mid-block or whatever. So we have in our work plan to look at the design manual and the UDO for exactly that purpose, and that would come up during that
Wonderful.
process.
Okay, so Dwight, have I heard you make a motion?
I have not. I wanted to make sure there was nothing we wanted to add to the motion as far as making it more complicated and digestible. So then I would suggest that I would move that we vote to approve the 2-lane sections presented for 2-lane divided 80-foot right-of-ways, 2-lane with center turn lane, divided avenues, and 2-lane with undivided avenues to use the, what are we going to call it? It is the side path option for both the city and NCDOT or the street.
No, it's not the side path.
Not the side path.
You said exactly the wrong
I said
thing.
exactly the wrong. I was trying to be so good. What's the wrong? Right word?
That's okay. It's
Side
with me and impervious and purpose. Every
Okay.
conversation with him, I always mess that
path.
up.
Undivided.
The ones with the separated bike lanes.
The ones with separated bike lanes, single way bike paths. Yeah.
The second and fourth option on every sheet.
Yeah.
We are on the same page, literally. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing up
Okay.
your concerns on that too, Elizabeth. Yeah.
So does anyone want to make a second to Dwight's motion?
Second this.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? We've already had plenty. Are we ready to vote? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much. Bicycle Planning Committee, you have completed your task now, is that true?
The work is never done.
The work is never done. Well, that happens, that happens.
Poetic.
But I guess, I'm kind of going back to the other thing, is
yes.
what happens with our recommendations? At this point, it's still a staff-to-staff discussion.
Right.
And when is the plan to finalize this document, the design manual?
I'm not sure what their production schedule is right now. 'Cause as the committee has seen, it's a very comprehensive document that guides a lot of different elements of everything associated with street construction, street access, driveways, et cetera. So we'll find out and let you know at the next meeting.
Okay, and they will be presenting to us again?
Yes.
Okay.
We plan to
And-
continue looking at the street design manual and giving them our opinion for as long as they'll take it until.
Right. Well, it's a huge task.
So,
It's a very huge task.
As long as
We-
they're still working, we're still going to work on it too.
We appreciate you taking that on. Community outreach, Rebecca.
Yes, we met and we discussed our work plan and we made sure it was in good order. And we're excited to have a new member.
Yes. Very exciting. Excellent. Well, thank you much. Pedestrian Planning Committee, that would be you, Elizabeth.
Yes, we did not meet this month, unfortunately, but fortunately, we had already established our priorities for this coming year's work plan.
Okay.
So happy to hit the ground running once that is approved.
Okay, and we've got that on the agenda soon. All right, we'll move on to old business, the bicycle parking standards.
And Mr. Crane has requested deferment until next month, please.
Okay, I was gonna say, is Travis really with us this evening? And
Not
the answer
yet.
is no. Okay, we will defer that. Then the next old business is the fiscal year 2020 work plan development, which was sent out in your minute packet. I think there had been a thing. We don't have everything all in one, though, do we?
Yeah, the overall set of goals for the entire committee, I didn't have anything on for the packet.
Well, at the last meeting, we did mention that we are going to have, if you look in the minutes, we're going to have the BPAC leadership meet with the Parks, Recreation, Greenway Advisory Board leadership at least yearly. So that is the overall commission. That was one thing we were adding to that. I don't believe we were planning on deleting or changing anything else. Does anybody remember anything else? Do we need to talk about the overall commission agendas?
So you propose that that's the only change to the work plan for the
The
total commission?
overall
The overall,
commission.
yeah. I think that's in line with what we discussed.
Because we did spend a few minutes on it last time. If you'll read in the previous minutes, Mr. Otwell recommended enhancing the inventory of parks, schools, libraries in terms of bicycle, pedestrian infrastructure. I don't know if that was really a line item we were going to add. The Pedestrian Planning Committee has already an action item dedicated to sidewalk improvements. I mentioned that the integration with transit is not adequately addressed, perhaps. Elizabeth had mentioned the advocacy role for funding, seeking grants. So I guess, you know, we had talked about those at the last full commission meeting. Well, I don't know where it happened to my copy of the work plan, but do we
There's
want to
also
make
there's also a comment about, we agreed to remove the initiative concerning providing input into the comprehensive plan update since the project is ongoing and wrapping up. Doesn't need to be on the 2020 work plan. That's the last sentence in the minutes for that discussion.
Oh, right. So I would say, and Paul, I don't know if you were the ones put this together, I think if you look at our previous minutes, that captures the things we had decided to add. Does anybody have anything else for the overall commission? Besides the ones that are listed in our previous board minutes? Let's talk about the outreach committee. You are deleting 2 items. Were the other ones new?
No.
Okay.
Pretty much the same.
Okay.
We're going to do, try and reach out to our CSEs and educate them and continue working with Safe Routes to School initiatives and continue doing what we were doing, so.
Right. The one thing is a speaker series
Yeah,
has been
we're
eliminated.
gonna do
And then bicycle planning committee, did that look accurate to those on that committee, the things that were in your minute packet? We have in blue promoting the 2016 Bike Raleigh Plan. We do have some updates on that one. Do you have your copy of that? Oh, yours isn't copied in blue. I have red and blue on my copy. I printed it at the house.
I'll see the colors.
So if the bicycle planning committee would take just a moment to review that, you do have completely new support and promote Raleigh's National Bike Month public events and identify bike corridors in need of bike lane bollards or other enhanced infrastructure to reduce conflicts and make recommendations for their implementations. You removed promoting the Raleigh Bike Share Program and work on the bike parking program for private properties. That look good to you guys?
Looks good to me.
And pedestrian planning, I think you guys have the new, completely new review curb cuts standards. You
We
have
do.
support sidewalk and other related pedestrian data, and coordinate with outreach committee on ways to help reach the general public.
That first item is, like the bicycle committee, looking at the streets manual. And because our committee has a really awesome array of mobility perspectives, wanted to look at how curb cuts are designed, the specifics of them.
Okay.
And challenges that might have for different mobility impairments.
Excellent, yeah. And you guys, we don't 100% know the schedule, but that is something you'll be working on.
That's right. That's our first item.
Yeah, okay. We removed the promote Walk Raleigh brand. So with those changes, does anybody have anything else to the work plan for 2020?
I'm concerned about getting this to council in July if we haven't seen a final consolidated view of this.
You mean typed out?
Correct. Can we
Accurate.
vote on the work plan tonight to take it as consolidated to the next available city council meeting? Because we do need to have it approved as close to the start of the fiscal year as possible, which is July 1st.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll have a clean version for you of the adopted version at your July council meeting. But the goal will be to have this adopted tonight and to have the clean version in front of the city council for the July 2nd meeting.
And I move that we go forward as stated with the consolidation and the changes just summarized in the discussion.
Okay,
Second.
thank you. Any more discussion? Okay. Paul, you feel like you understand the the additions to the overall, because I think the other committees are pretty clear. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, please? Say nay. Great, thank you. The motion passes to move forward with our 2020 work plan development. The next is review of proposed UDO two-lane cross-sections. We already did that, didn't we? Yeah. New business, downtown transportation plan. At long last, they've been sitting patiently waiting for us. Please come forward, anxious to see you and hear from you again.
So this is an item that's been in front of the commission previously, that as we're working to implement the city's bus rapid transit in downtown, it has created some trade-offs relative to a lot of our previous planning for parts of downtown, and there's some significant implications as it relates to the bike network that was conceived. And so we've got our team here. Mila Vega from our transit division is here to talk.
Thank you, Eric. I will provide a quick overview of the timeline and really the core of the presentation today. And then I have Betty White from Kimley Horn and Caitlin Tomlin from Kittleson, and they will go over some of the technical recommendations. I should probably start with saying that you've seen the recommendations again. This is us coming back to just to make sure that as we are wrapping up the process, we have one more touch point, and again, we're happy to receive feedback, and we can share how we are planning to use these recommendations moving forward as we are implementing BRT project, and what does that mean for the bike plan recommendations. So presentation today really have several sections, but we'll try to keep it brief. We'll talk about the timeline, again, to remind you where we started, the work that we went through, kind of share a summary of some touch points with the community. We will share BRT recommendations, bicycle network, and our next step, again, how we're going to use this information. There will be a requested action today. We are not asking you to formally adopt the plan because we know it's a blueprint, and we will be using it as we are moving forward with implementation and project development, environmental clearance. But we are asking for your endorsement, or in other words, support to make sure that we're all comfortable with overall recommendations, and as we are coordinating projects, that we are all on the same page. We did ask Raleigh Transit Authority to endorse the BRT recommendation section. So today we're in front of you asking to endorse bike plan recommendation section. This is our overall schedule. We started the process, we kicked it off in March of 2018, and today we are in June of 2019. Took us a little bit over a year to really develop recommendations. As you can see from a summary at the bottom, we had a number of activities, numerous stakeholder, technical, and advisory committee meetings, 2 large public meetings that were well attended. Both meetings were held at the convention center. One was to really introduce some of the BRT routing alternatives and some trade-offs, and the other is to share where we were heading with our final recommendations, and also how we used the feedback received at the first meeting. So this is really my quick brief intro. I will hand it off to Betty from this slide moving forward. This is really a quick, and Betty will provide an overview of the volumes that we will be working on. We do have the executive summary of the document, about 30-40 pages, posted on the project website, goraleigh.org/downtown plan. So as we are developing the full volumes, they will be posted there. But you can review the executive summary of some of the maps. Again, it's, the report is has graphics and maps. We try to keep it user-friendly so members of the public can also read it and get the gist of the recommendations. So that's all I have.
Okay, so like Mila mentioned, the executive summary is available online. If you go to goraleigh.org, it's the first link at the top to click to the downtown plan, and then you can click on the executive summary. In July, we'll have all 4 of these volumes available, which are the 4 different reports that we've created over the past 18 months. Those include the existing conditions and current system inventory for all of downtown, which just has a lot of the existing conditions, data for traffic, bicycle infrastructure, transit ridership, on-street parking, sidewalk inventory, stuff like that. The second volume will be the scenario evaluation report, which shows how we developed the different BRT and bike scenarios and then how we evaluated them and screened them out to get the final recommendations. And the third volume is the implementation plan, which outlines how we recommend implementing the BRT and bicycle and bus improvements over the next 10 years in downtown Raleigh. And then the fourth volume is the public outreach compendium, which just shows all the events that we had, all the input that we got, who attended, which events, and the public meeting feedback that we got online, both online and in person. So right now, the executive summary is available, like Mila said, online. And Maricel, you and your kid's picture is in one of the pictures in the executive summary from the public meeting. And so it's a very high-level overview of these 4 volumes so that City Council and the public could kind of quickly see what we did. And then the 4 volumes are much more detailed and much bigger documents that will be available online for people who want to dig more into the details behind it. Like Mila said, you've already seen these recommendations. These were presented at the public meeting and presented to council a few weeks ago. For BRT, the near-term BRT has been identified as New Bern Avenue, and the routing for downtown is to use Wilmington and Blunt to go Raleigh Station and then go back out to New Bern Avenue. For the midterm BRT, the city has identified the South BRT corridor and the West BRT corridor to be the midterm corridors that will be implemented. And so we recommended still continuing on Wilmington and Blunt to the south and coming in to go Raleigh Station and then just turning around using that one-way pair of Wilmington and Blunt. And then for the full build-out, this is where we left alternatives open right now for BRT because of the current developments and things that are happening along West Street, the new Raleigh Union Station bus facility that's being proposed, the West Street Extension project, which is the next phase is still to be designed and construction funding hasn't been allocated for that yet. So because of all the different things that are happening in downtown and different developments that will take place over the next few years, we left some alternatives open for the city to use those decision points throughout now in the next few years to decide which corridor for BRT is best for the full build-out situation. And then for the bike network, we recommended the full build-out bike network that coincides with the BRT, and I'm going to let Caitlin go into more detail about that.
Great. So yeah, just to build off of Betty and Mila, what they talked about is I'm going to be giving an overview of the bike recommendations that we're looking for endorsement tonight on. So the map you see on the right is the full build out of the bike network. The solid blue lines are what we're calling Tier 1 bike facilities. And these are fully separated bike facilities. So there's physical separation between the bike lane and traffic. Where you're seeing dashed blue lines, those are what are called tier 2 facilities. And I have some examples of these on the next slide. And these are either buffered bike lanes or bikeways. A couple of key things to note about these recommendations, and we've talked about this a bit before, but something you'll notice between the two maps is there are no bike facilities recommended on streets where there are BRT recommendations, and that was done purposefully. We're trying to find a way to make the two networks complement each other, not conflict with one another. An exciting part of that is if you were actually to overlay these maps, nearly every street in downtown is going to have either transit or bike facilities, which is very exciting. The other thing I wanted to point out about these recommendations, we were able to evaluate it, and about 96% of downtown is accessible via a continuous low-stress trip with the implementation of these bike recommendations. So again, we're trying to create complete networks and provide continuous connections through the downtown area. So as I mentioned before, these are just some renderings of what these facilities could look like. So the solid blue lines you saw on the map before, those are tier 1 facilities. And again, physical separation can look a little different given the context, given the right-of-way considerations. So they can look like a multi-use path or urban trail. What we've seen more and more are parking protected bike lanes, where you actually use the lane of parking and put the bike lane between the curb and the parking lane and use the parking for physical protection. Two-way cycle tracks are also an option, and then the one-way cycle track without parking is shown there. And then for the tier 2 facilities, we're showing a buffered bike lane and a bike way. Something else that's also important to note, we really, and I'll go back to this map, we really tried to use the tier 1 facilities is really your core network, and then your tier 2 facilities are what we call supporting facilities. They're strategically picked to help direct traffic to the protected facilities and create those intuitive connections to those tier 1 facilities. So to talk through some next steps, the BRT routing recommendations have been endorsed by RTA. Near-term BRT recommendations are currently in NEPA and preliminary design. The midterm BRT, that process is expected to start later this summer or in the fall of this year. And the full build-out alternatives, that's expected to start in the summer or fall of next year, 2020. And then the next steps for the bike network recommendation is in coordination with that BRT implementation is to coordinate with the city CIP for funding for those projects. So as Mila mentioned at the beginning, RTA did endorse the BRT recommendations, and we're requesting that the BPAC endorse the recommendations for the bike recommendations in this plan. One thing I want to point out is that endorsement just means you support the direction and blueprint this plan provides. And I'm happy to take any questions, or we are happy to take any questions.
I have a few, I'm sorry. So my question, will always, I know that this is just, a formal bureaucratic process where we're providing the next step to move forward, but I still want to hone in on, like with the Wake Transit Plan, I can track the dollars to implementation for that. And I can see, very clearly if I pull up the annual plan, I can see the dollars that are being allocated to that BRT corridor. So I still want to understand the funding and implementation strategy for the tier 1 bike facilities, because they are so critical and they are impacted by the BRT. I know that's a broader question for, collaboratively between Go Raleigh and the transportation department, and I just show me the money,
Well, I cannot show you a dedicated funding source, unfortunately. There is a dedicated funding source for transit, and I have to kind of give a disclaimer, dedicated funding source for new transit. So we can't even offset our existing cost. That's not eligible.
Right.
That's the same thing goes for the federal funding source, where certain strings are attached to how we can access the funding. So it will be more difficult to implement, not more difficult, but it will require more creativity and coordination to implement bike recommendations, because there is not a dedicated funding source. That's at least one question we don't have to worry about, or at least partially we don't have to worry. Hopefully federal government comes through on the transit side. With that said, we do understand that this is an important part of the plan, even though there is not a dedicated funding source associated with that. So we will definitely coordinate with Eric's team and work through the regular CIP process just to make sure that we can identify resources as we are moving with BRT implementation. Earlier, I think Jonathan mentioned there is not a schedule associated with bike plan. There is actually, the final report will propose a tiered, the same way you see tiered implementation for BRT, it will propose tiered implementation for bike plans, so you can see how the entire network could work, assuming we can identify funding. So at least it gives us a starting point to say, okay, if there is a commitment and if there's funding, we can follow this blueprint to get the entire network.
Sure.
But again, I know I'm not providing the most popular answer. It will require us more to work and be a little bit more creative and identify those resources within the city. We probably will be able to access some federal dollars as we're looking at access to the stations. Again, it's not going to offer full build out, but anywhere we need to improve access or we need to mitigate impact that the BRT project is causing to the bike network, those could be eligible expenses. Again, coordination is critical because we don't want to start dropping random pieces of the network. We want to make sure that we approach this in a comprehensive way and start building useful and usable sections.
Right. Yeah, those were a few other questions I had were when we do the corridor alignment for the New Bern corridor and we kind of start to spec out where things will actually physically go, will that include, as part of that scoping process, the Tier 1 bike facility that needs to accompany that with implementation, or would those be totally separate processes?
So again, the plan, do you want to talk about the phased bike plan?
I can
Oh,
talk about
okay.
that.
You can talk about that and I'll jump back with BRT.
Okay, yeah, so with the phasing of the bike recommendation, the phasing was done around two things. One, with each implementation of BRT, the BRT stations were accessible from the four corners of downtown via the recommendations we were saying to go with that phase. The other piece we identified was where you need to do mitigation. So what recommendations do you need to implement when you put in this phase of BRT to mitigate any impacts to the bike network?
Okay.
So I guess to answer is yes, there is a starting point which aligns BRT implementation, the overall project, and these recommendations. But we'll just have to make sure we coordinate to identify funding. Where we cannot use federal funding, we would need to figure out where that funding gap comes from.
So is that something BPAC should take upon itself to help with coordination of that so that we're ready for implementation? I mean, what would be the advised next steps here as far as making sure that there is funding to implement?
Project prioritization.
Okay.
Prioritization. If you want these projects, they've got to be at the top of the list. And right now, as I said, this process is very disruptive to all the prior planning we've
Sure.
done in the city.
Right.
The bike plan was adopted in 2016, 3 years ahead of all of this. The bike plan lays out what our priorities are for spending on bicycle infrastructure. So if we're going to go after these aggressively, we've got to change that list.
But were there no downtown projects in our implementation plan?
Absolutely, yes.
So if those are disrupted or no longer valid, would they just be replaced by this Tier 1 facility? The Tier 1
Potentially.
facility will probably cost more to implement, so where is that funding going to come from?
From our capital improvement program.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I know you're probably not done with your questions, but I guess I just want to understand the federal funding. I would think federal funding would be available if you're leaving the downtown bike infrastructure in worse condition than it is.
That's a conversation we're having along New Bern Avenue right now. Do you mind pulling back up the big map?
Yeah, I would just think that, federal funds would be available for mitigation, if you are.
Yeah.
If
Both
we could, I guess
mitigation and access.
Right, well, I guess my point is that we could be left in a position where we have
nothing
less than we have now.
That's right.
And I didn't think that federal funding worked that way.
That's the conversation that we're having right now. So for example, as you see the routing to the west along Morgan Street and New Bern Avenue and Edenton Street, this would entail the removal of existing bicycle facilities on Morgan and on New Bern. And so the conversation we've had in the context of the BRT project for New Bern is how do we replace those facilities as part of the BRT project? And that's one of the things we're asking for as far as, is that an eligible expense that can be handled as part of the federal BRT project, or are we expected to have to go back and fund that separately ourselves?
And from what I understand, again, at the end of the day, it will be going back to the FTA and they will look at line item by line item as they're approving this grant funding agreement, and they'll tell us what's eligible, what's not. But the general feedback that I'm getting from consultants, and I worked on other BRT projects before, is if you cause an impact, whether it's to bike network or parking or anything, you are to mitigate it either by replacing it or setting aside funding to have it replaced as part of the overall project. So I'm not too concerned about the areas, to be honest with you, where we will be impacting, because then there's a case of, okay, we came in with this project and we created this impact that needs to be mitigated. It's like mitigating traffic impacts, right? You have a development, you create traffic issues, you need to mitigate them. You need to put money towards that. I'm more concerned about the other areas to make sure we build in this comprehensive network, not just, we mitigated this section, but then what?
Needs to connect to something.
It needs to connect to something. So we need to make sure that that prioritization of projects that Eric referred to actually falls in line with the BRT implementation plan. So as we are moving forward and we are mitigating the sections that we are impacting, there is also a logical way of prioritizing those projects that would connect further.
Let me ask a hypothetical question. If we decided the two should be together and we should take cars off those streets, would the federal funding pay for that?
Especially it's one-way streets, right? Is BRT running curbside?
That is the operating approach
Well,
right now.
it's a hypothetical question because, like I said, I just sort of feel like it seems odd that we could be left.
It's not odd, it's also very dangerous because I emphasize, I take the bus every day. I use my bike to get to the bus. And that's how, nobody drives to get to the bus. They walk or they bike there, and we have to make sure our multimodal infrastructure is one,
Well, is it a realistic question of removing general purpose lanes?
Yes.
Completely in downtown. I'm not going to try to answer that question.
BRT is removing a lane, right?
BRT is probably going to remove on-street parking.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the main assumptions that we started with
from the beginning
was no street in downtown is going to have no cars on it. There was no street that can, the traffic network can't handle it right now.
Yeah.
So there was no transit only or bike only, ped only streets. One of the other I would say tens of recommendations that we had or assumptions that we started with was there will not be BRT on Fayetteville Street. So that just doesn't make sense, and that's not what Fayetteville Street is used for right now. So there were certain things, and that was one of them, was there will not be any transit only or bike ped transit only streets in downtown just because the traffic network couldn't handle it, but it can be reduced by a lane, or the lanes can be reshuffled and on-street parking could be removed to accommodate BRT or bike or whatever. And one thing I also want to point out is, so for the Blunt Person two-way conversion, projects like that are on the horizon, we took those into consideration with these recommendations. And so for the midterm BRT, we have BRT one way on Wilmington going north and then one way on Blunt going south. And so because there's bike lanes on Wilmington and then there's bike lanes proposed to be on Blunt, we show a two-way, tier one, two-way cycle track or two-way facility on Person because we don't want to propose bike on those two BRT streets. So we understand, we took into consideration the upcoming projects where either there are already bike lanes out there or they're going to be this summer or next year or something like that, and then try to repurpose where they could be once the BRT is implemented, because it is a phased approach. So the city will just have to continue to coordinate with those projects as they come along, and that's what we try to do with our recommended implementation plan for the bike infrastructure.
And to that end, I mentioned before the phase 2 of the Blunt Person project moving into design.
Right.
So the design team is very well aware of these potential changes. And it means, as I said before, some different expectations with the community based on what we did several years ago with the Blunt Person corridor planning. So that's one of the things that we'll have to go out and communicate as part of that project, that we're making this type of change, that we're no longer proposing bike facilities on a portion of Blunt Street, but now we're doubling down literally on Person Street.
Right. And I can tell you, after visiting some peer communities that have cycle tracks implemented, one-way facilities do provide some advantages to implementing a two-way bidirectional bike facility if there is, if we continue to do the change where we want to go to the bidirectional on Person Street, that's one thing, but as we're looking with Harrington Street, that does have some different complications. And as far as signalization and implementation, So I do have two final questions. One, on this map, I once saw a map like this that showed us, like, this is the road we want to do the cycle track on. This is the one where the urban trail would be. But I haven't seen it. Like, I would love to look at this and know where those things are going to go to hone on, so could we get a copy of this map that shows us the proposed facility, not just tier 1?
Well, because there isn't funding identified, we couldn't say.
Okay, but
what
you
is-
sound like you have an idea of what's going where.
We
Like
have,
Person
in
Street.
the implementation plan, we have some recommendations.
Okay.
Like, we recommend Lenore Street be an urban trail.
Yeah, I saw that,
Because it
right.
connects to the greenways and the
Right.
heart to heart and
Mhm.
things like that, the East Coast Greenway. So
And you
we just
currently have it
recommend-
shown as a tier 1 in the map over
It's
there.
a tier- yeah.
That's the
That's one of the
east-west
tier
and the
one.
south side of town.
Yeah,
That's Lenore.
it's a tier 1 facility, which in the implementation plan, you'll be able to see, we propose it to be a multi-use path urban trail on the sidewalk, and we show taking out parking and how you could
Right.
accommodate that.
Okay.
And cost.
That's for my own edification, and I'm a very visual person and ride these facilities daily, and I would just like to think through implementation in a way that's I can see in my head.
Right.
My-
The implementation plan will have the
Right.
phased,
Okay.
tier 1, tier 2. It just doesn't identify which tier 1 facility is which.
But some of them start to have that conversation?
Some of them have, we
Okay.
have a map just for Lenore Street to show why it
And then
should be-
Person Street sounds like another one that's been identified as a cycle
Person
track?
has its own section in the
Okay,
plan that
yeah.
talks about the
Cool.
2 phases and how it would be implemented.
And then that will be on the transportation team to finesse that out further, or what's the next step?
No, that would be incorporated into the current
Big plan.
project design that we have underway.
Okay.
Yeah. The
So,
other
yeah.
big pivot with this plan
Uh-huh.
is that in previous downtown planning, we have been working towards a Martin Street cycle track that would tie into the north-south corridor and run basically from Raleigh Union Station
Right.
across to Chavis Greenway.
Sure.
So in this plan,
Can't do it.
because of the variability in the map on the left with designating that as a potential BRT connector
Right.
between Go Raleigh Station and Raleigh Union Station, that's now off the table. And so the new proposal is that we would be looking at Davie Street.
Okay,
That's a pretty significant change as it relates to impacts to parking and infrastructure.
sure.
Really hilly. It's very hilly.
So, I know this is a lot to digest. So my final question is, have these cross-sections been measured to verify that these types of facilities can be implemented on these streets?
Yes.
So we know we have the width to do the cycle track?
Yes.
Okay.
Are we going to kill all my trees?
No, I ain't
Do we-
taking
I
none
mean,
of your
it's-
trees.
it's-
I will plant you.
It's going to be within the
Curbs.
curbs.
I'm gonna put my David Eatman hat on, and yes, we verified to the best of our ability at this stage of the study. Again, this is not NEPA level, this is not design level, so anything can happen once you start digging in and you can find something that you might need to readjust, so I'm just putting that disclaimer out. But with the information we have right now, we believe for both BRT and bike network, the space is sufficient to accommodate what we are proposing.
Thank you.
Within the right of way.
Within the right of way.
Not within the curb.
Right, oh, right,
Can you dig
okay.
into that for a little bit?
Can we what?
Or can I start?
Go ahead, girl.
So the one word nobody has said tonight is pedestrian. I'm just the chair of the pedestrian committee. I'd like to ask about the pedestrian. And I know that the Urban Design Center is covering that part of the scope, but I'm still concerned that I don't have a full understanding of the pedestrian impacts of this project. So can you talk to me a little bit more about curbs moving? I mean, I know they're not going to move in. They're going to move towards the buildings. which impacts
So like Mila said, what we looked at was basically GIS line work for downtown of where the curb lines are, which can be, a couple of feet plus or minus. And then we went out in pinch points in the field. We verified it with Google Earth, and then we went out where there were pinch points in the field and measured and tried to make sure if there potentially could be an issue or not. Whenever we looked at the bike facility infrastructure, we tried to accommodate the facilities within the width of an on-street parking lane. So if you took the on-street parking out, then theoretically you wouldn't have to move the curbs. And we worked with the city and UDC to identify which streets are most important for sidewalk use, like for on-street sidewalk dining, outdoor dining, and dining locations, and then the UDC had done a study of just pedestrian traffic and pedestrian movements in downtown where it was the heaviest on certain streets. And those streets, the city said, you know, we can't narrow the sidewalk at all. And the minimum sidewalk width for all of the assumptions in the plan is 14 feet minimum on both sides. It's set for over on West Street or in certain places where it isn't 14 feet. So if it was already less than 14 feet, we weren't proposing to widen it. But like Fayetteville Street, obviously, we were not proposing to narrow the sidewalk. In different locations like that where the sidewalk width is already, you know, in compromise because of certain trade-offs with outdoor dining and pedestrians and events and things like that. We identified those and tried to prioritize those. The streetscape aspect, like you were saying, is being taken out by the UDC to do a separate streetscape master plan and have a process with engaging the public and getting feedback. And that will be incorporated with the BRT design for how it looks in downtown and how the pedestrian access, you know, is coordinated to get to the stations and what the requirements are for sidewalk widths and things like that. That'll probably be part of the design criteria for the BRT project. But in the downtown plan, we definitely looked at it and kind of built our plan around it, but we didn't make specific pedestrian improvement recommendations.
Can you tell me a little bit more about where the pedestrian impacts might be? So looking at these sections, thank you for the clarification about where the curbs won't move. The urban trail section looks like the one that would have the most impact on pedestrians. So you mentioned Lenore Street. Are there others that you think that might be where your tier 1 facility is?
So all 4 of these are the tier 1,
Sure, that's just the one that happens at the expense of pedestrian space.
Right, so.
Yeah, Lenore Street's really the only one.
Okay.
We kind of have up front of gut feeling that's the recommendation.
Yeah.
And that's because of its regional trail connections and heart to art.
And the proposal in the implementation plan is to take on-street parking and move the curb in, you know, to take the space where the on-street parking was and keep the sidewalk width that's there, and then just add that width as the trail. So it's not really
It's just
decreasing.
a woefully insufficient sidewalk right now.
Okay.
Okay. So that's good to me to know that that's the only one that would be at the expense. A few more questions. So 14 feet from back of curb to face of building was the minimum. Okay. And we talked about tier 1. I noticed that some of the sections for the tier 1 facilities, you're looking at one-way streets. Is that just kind of like random, or I think I'm getting where Mary's going. Is like, do you guys have a general idea of which streets these will be?
The only two-way.
I think one side of the street.
Most of them are one-way streets.
Yeah.
And then the only two-way cycle track that we propose is obviously on Harrington because it's already proposed. And then any other two-way streets, we just, you know, made a provision for what that could look like versus there's more one-way streets that we're proposing facilities on. So there's just a couple options for the one-way.
Gotcha. I just know that in the downtown master plan, in the previous downtown master plan, the goal was towards two-way streets. So wondering if those would still work, these schemes would still work. If
Like
streets were
two-way
converted
streets
to
in
two-way.
terms of traffic, or?
Correct? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And y'all aren't converting any street traffic directions of street?
No.
Okay.
Not as part of this plan, but like Mary said, there are it's more complicated when you have a two-way street.
Yeah.
And you're doing the one-way bike facility rather than a two-way or one-way on a one-way street.
Yeah, I think that's where I get a little frustrated that we've had the pedestrian component of this cleaved from the discussion, and I know that you all have budgetary limitations that probably push you that way, but it's frustrating to exempt one mode, right? When you might ride the bus you might ride the bike to the bus, but everybody gets off of it as a pedestrian, right?
Yep.
So I'll get off my soapbox on that one. Then my final question was about a specific road and what's going on Morgan. I know that there is a specific area plan for Morgan that looks at that as being a pretty substantial route, and it seems to be a route of choice for both pedestrians and cyclists, just in the way that it's being used now. There's also a lot of redevelopment coming there. It also doesn't terminate.
I'm trying to figure out what the question is.
What's the
There's
question
no
about
facilities on Morgan.
for bike?
Bike facilities.
Bike or
Yeah, so.
BRT.
Yeah.
Not untouched.
So, part of the reason there's no bike facilities recommended on Morgan is because you do have BRT recommended on a part of Morgan. And when we tried to think about how do we get people east-west across the downtown area, and Morgan Street was definitely one of them we considered, but the value of Hillsborough Street is it does connect all the way through out to NC State. You have the width there to do a Tier 1 facility there now. You have bike lanes there. You have the space allocated. And then you can use your north-south streets as you get into downtown on Harrington and on Salisbury Street to connect people either to the south and get across on Davie or to the north and get continue across on Jones. So we kind of use Hillsborough as that core piece that goes through going east-west, and then it splits off around what is the state capitol, which is a pesky little barrier.
Yeah, that's why I was wondering about Morgan, at least that western part of Morgan. In a previous life, I worked on that area of West Morgan Street, and the feedback we were hearing from the community was that that was the preferred facility because Hillsborough is used so much for on-street parking and for access to the school. And also, I don't think it would be too selfish to ask for parallel premier facilities. You can have parallel BRT premier facilities.
As a bicyclist that rides downtown a lot, I would prefer to take Morgan anytime over Hillsborough.
Yeah.
Period.
Ditto.
Even though both have transit, it's both a transit corridor right now with buses, but Morgan works better for a cyclist. Also, the recent paving on Morgan downtown has made that facility even better.
So how many parking spots will be affected by the bicycle network?
Did you ever determine that?
That will be in the implementation plan, and like I said, it's just basically an assumption. We did an assumed width for each facility and then measured, average widths on each street, and so we assume if you take all the on-street parking on this segment, you can put in this Tier 1 facility, and so we just counted spaces that way. The bike has quite a substantial more impacts than the BRT does, just because there's more facilities on more streets, but it's broken down in the implementation plan. I don't have the numbers on me.
The assumption that we did move forward with was only one side of the street parking would be removed if it needed to be removed for a bike facility.
And also, when we looked at parking, we looked both on-street and off-street just to understand the magnitude of impact to the overall number of spaces. We understand that obviously on-street parking is the most valuable, but we try to understand both sides as well. So,
right.
I know Kim Horn did calculation for both BRT and the bike. So I apologize. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I remember reviewing the percentages for, this is on street and this is off street and what it looks like for the downtown.
It seems like it might be helpful to quantify that is because we can't have shared BRT and bike, because that's a policy decision, and I'm not arguing with it. It's just, I think it will be, I would predict that it would be more politically feasible to remove parking spaces for BRT than it would for bike lanes. So if we could tie those three things together, because that decision-making was tied together, just in our communication, I think that would be helpful. Instead of, the bikes took more parking.
Yes.
It's like the whole system, which is connected, took a lot of parking.
Because I think the pressure and the frustration to a certain extent is that this plan, although it was a multimodal plan, it really was a BRT plan, and then there was some pushback, and more and more it became a little bit, there were further finessing to get to this point, I think. And that it has to be a multimodal plan, right? We have to be we have to have people-oriented mobility options for folks. And right now, we don't have a lot of that. And this is an opportunity to really get to a launching point with that if it's done right. And yeah, I think we just need to really be communicating the value that this has to the community and how it has to be done on a corridor by corridor basis. We can't just do the Newbern BRT if we're not doing it with a parallel pedestrian and bicycle facility. So yeah, I think as we're talking about loss of parking, that has to be perhaps maybe communicated on a corridor basis, not by on a mode basis, because we're trying to get to show how this corridor is going to be successful, and it will only be successful if it's people oriented.
Definitely. And part of the endorsement that we're asking for the bike recommendations, we feel like helps show that they are tied together and helps show City Council if we're going forward with BRT. You know, these bike recommendations have been endorsed and are, you know, have been shown to the public. And so the phasing of both at the same time seem to be more tied together because the BRT has been, you know, endorsed through RTA. And so that's kind of the thought process behind getting BPAC to endorse the bike recommendations.
Okay.
Other comments, questions?
I have another question. I'm looking at the Tier 2 bicycle facilities, and some of these lines terminate and within the study boundaries, and I can't figure out why. For example, I think that St. Mary's Street terminates at Morgan and doesn't go to the actual street terminus at Hargett, but it doesn't look like that's a BRT route. So just wondering, there's a few of those.
It's basically this
Right,
block.
I think one street might be because of the line. I want to see them overlaid. Facilities on Morgan right here. Terminates ironically at Morgan Street.
Yeah,
And Hargett as well.
I remember the discussion around that, but I'm not recalling the exact reason. But I'm happy to find that and address that question separately.
So are there any more iterative processes to identify if staff here with transportation deem that certain corridors are underserviced in this plan? Is there a mechanism to rectify that over time? I know you guys said it was a blueprint. How are we treating this as a living document?
Well, I think that's why we're really using it as a blueprint, not a formal adoption, because we understand as we move forward with BRT and bike plan implementation, and we're looking at environmental clearance and design, things will start to shift to some degree. So we feel as far as part of the overall project development for BRT and associated tiered recommendation for bike network, that process is really the opportunity to review the proposed concepts and look at if they still are relevant and if they're workable through design. So individual project development, I'd say for BRT corridors, that would be a vehicle to really coordinate that work. And again, going back to the city's CIP process and prioritization of projects, that we just have to, I can't stress enough the importance of coordination and communication within the city departments to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think, you know, my other thought is that I would really like this commission, whoever's in this commission over time, to have the ability to have fluid input on this on a quarter by quarter basis. So as we go through, you know, Newbern's our first plan of action, that it is holistically thought out in a sense that, you know, these commissions are continually providing feedback early and often.
We will be obviously happy to come back as often as you would like to see us in front of this board. Also, as part of the BRT implementation, there will be a tiered committee structure with stakeholder committee meeting about on a quarterly basis just to really provide feedback from various interests that they represent and make sure that as we are going through design, in addition to all the public meetings and all the communications, that there is another layer of oversight and feedback that we are not missing critical points.
How well does this plan map out with the current trips and demand for bicycle use downtown? Like Hillsborough Street, you guys talked about that a little bit with Hillsborough Street and Morgan Street, and I'm familiar with that corridor, but I'm not nearly as familiar with the south and the east side of Raleigh.
Trips for bikes.
So the intent was to make every parcel or every feasible parcel in downtown accessible via continuous slow stress trip. So, you know, we did look at existing bike counts that the city had, pedestrian counts that the city had, but the idea was to create a complete network that made all of downtown accessible. And that's where we strategically went through and did, I think, during your retreat, we went over this, but we did a level of traffic stress analysis. We tried to understand, okay, where do our low stress streets already exist? What's the network we can already leverage? And then what are critical corridors that we absolutely need to prioritize bikes on so that you can create this complete network. And that's where those tier 1 facilities rose to the top. These are the streets that when you think about where people are really isolated in those islands where they have to cross a barrier to get from one side of downtown to the other, these are the streets that starts to break down those barriers. So we didn't look at OD studies or anything like that. The idea was to make the entire downtown area connected in a continuous way.
Do you guys ride your bikes around downtown at all?
Excuse me?
Do you guys ride your bikes around downtown at all?
Yeah.
I have a question about one of the terms used on a Tier 2 facility. Could you pop back on that? The term bikeway?
Just a
Is
share.
that a standardized phrase? It seems to be misleading because the way it's
Just a
designed
road.
here. Looks
Yeah,
like it's
so-
no special bike facility whatsoever.
So a
Is that
bike,
right?
yeah, a bikeway is, we would not and will not propose any bikeways on streets that aren't already low stress. The typical application of bikeways is they're signed routes and or shadowed routes. We do not recognize them as a dedicated bike facility, but they are still important to recognize in the plan because they are streets where you want to strategically use things like traffic calming and use communication tools to drivers to understand these are streets to expect bicyclists to use to get to the Tier 1 facilities.
Yeah, we have some bikeways in the existing bike plan. They're just not in downtown for the most part.
And we're talking about the lower right diagram here, which didn't show me anything like sharrows or traffic calming.
Fayetteville Street would be a good example.
Okay.
Low volume, low
So
speed.
that's like the bike boulevard in the
Yes,
existing
it's another term for bike boulevard. And Betty pointed out something important to point out is that these are really streets dedicated to under 3,000 vehicles a day and or 25 miles per hour or under.
I have a follow-up question. This might be a little naive since I work primarily on pedestrian issues. Why wouldn't every road in downtown be a Tier 2 facility then? Like, I'm looking at, Martin
Right.
Street, I know that like terminates into where you'll have a BRT line, but we want
So-
all roads to be
Yeah, by,
Miles an hour.
25 and low stress.
so
or
by,
have a bike
yeah.
lane.
I think I understand your question. The reason every street wouldn't be a bikeway is because you are, again, we're strategically picking streets where you're communicating to drivers to really expect bicyclists here. And we also don't want to communicate that on streets that maybe aren't safe to do so.
Sure, I could understand that on Dawson and McDowell. I'm just, I can understand how it would look ambitious on a map, and you would certainly need prioritization, key prioritization. But for example, like the eastern section of Martin Street, to communicate to a car that you will not encounter a bike there, I think is misleading charitably. But yet it is not a Tier 2 facility. It seems to me like the Tier 2 facility, whether that is a bikeway or a bike lane, should be used really extensively, maybe even more extensively. And maybe that's not, maybe that's ambitious from a funding standpoint, but since we're at the master planning phase. Like every road gets a sidewalk, why isn't a bike welcome on every street?
That's a good one.
Sometimes dumb questions are good.
Well, I think, to kind of wrap this up, because it's just been a lot of information to take in, and we all want so much to see this implemented right, and we want to see it implemented well. So I think I would propose that we move forward with a recommendation of this plan in the sense that we have a desire to continually be engaged in this process on a quarter by quarter basis. I'm getting a head shake over here. Do you want to go first then?
No, it's fine. I mean, I could certainly be the dissenting vote.
Right, right.
I support you all. I just want you to go further.
Sure.
And I
And-
want us to know more
right.
details before we vote.
Okay, I respect that.
I'd like a little bit more clarity on what we're actually voting on. So we're voting to approve these particular treatments on these particular streets. No, we're just voting that we would like
We've
to
been asked
see
for an endorsement
an
of
endorsement.
where we're heading. And I
So
think
like,
we've given
but
you a lot of
so like I
feedback
can't see
as
the
well.
map. I don't know what
Yeah,
roads
we're
and
asking
what
for your
tiers you're looking
general
at here.
support
So-
for this map that shows blue solid and dashed lines, which are tier 1 and tier 2 bike facilities. Your support means that we are heading in the right direction as we're looking at the projects. As Mary pointed out, and I believe Susan, that we will be going back on a quarterly basis and continue to work with you. So this is not the final approval and we just wrap up the plan and walk away. This is really your support for us to continue to advance to the next phase and really start working on implementation as we are implementing BRT projects.
Do you know when we would have a tiered phasing plan by?
Yes, by July. The recommended. Are you asking for the tiered? Yes, the recommendation will be available in the implementation report. Again, that question that we started with about funding, we will have to coordinate with CIP and prioritize the projects appropriately.
So Mary, did your motion call for that
I
endorsement?
don't know if I've ever
Oh,
done something that full, so I'm feeling a little bit, have some trepidation here now. Well, my main feedback was to propose that we move forward with the
endorsing, but making sure we're getting
an iterative process to continue to provide feedback, especially as the corridors are developed and engineered out, so that we can make sure, as we have those site-specific concerns about curb width and bicycle facilities, we're addressing them head-on. But
Could you repeat and clarify that motion?
Okay, gonna try this again. I propose we endorse this plan with the intention that we will have an iterative process of continual communication to ensure bicycle and pedestrian facilities.
right. At the level we have been given information, we endorse it, and you'd like to hear more in the future.
Keep me posted, please.
Yes, we'll keep you posted.
Keep me, write me a Christmas card if you know
Okay,
what I
so
mean.
that was a motion.
Would you entertain a friendly amendment?
Of course.
With the caveat that I might still vote against it.
Go for it.
Could we add Morgan Street? I don't see any reason not to.
Sure. Can we propose that we add Morgan Street? That's a friendly amendment.
Can we look at it and
This
just?
was already on the map and then it got changed and got taken off and I can't remember who or what the conversation was, but there was Morgan Street was on the map and then there's been a lot of iterations. Can we just look back at whose comment we addressed to take it off so we can understand what the reasoning behind it was?
I mean, I'd certainly be interested in hearing it, but.
Are you proposing as a tier 1 or tier 2 facility?
She doesn't care. She wants every line in downtown to be some level.
Didn't you hear the woman?
And I don't think that's crazy.
No, it's not crazy. I don't think it's crazy.
Well, it's not crazy at all. The only reason it's a bit crazy is that if it's as part of the BRT project, it implies that there are no priorities.
But
which I
this
think
is a
going back to
downtown
what-
pedestrian. This is a downtown transportation plan. It's not a BRT plan.
And one point I want to be clear about, and I think this is the reason Morgan Street ended up falling off it. These recommendations are priorities to create a continuous, low-stress connected network, and the recommendations were based on the level of the traffic volumes and speeds and level of parking incursion that happens on the streets. So all of these recommendations are intended to be low-stress facilities. Sure.
I think what's frustrating to me, and this is probably outside of your scope, is that it seems to me like a downtown transportation plan is exactly the time to have that conversation about the trade-offs. And maybe it was a conversation that we haven't been privy to.
So, Ms. Alley, if I can make a suggestion for your motion, if you can, since there's
amendment,
overlap on Morgan, on a portion of East Morgan, can you specify that Morgan west of Harrington Street? that would provide continuity with other
Correct.
facilities. and
Correct,
not
yeah, that was the
overlap
part that
BRT.
was in the area plan.
That does seem reasonable, so I think that,
You accept that friendly amendment.
all about it.
Is anyone going to second this motion?
Help me out, brothers. Nobody?
All right, Pierre went for it. Any further discussion?
I think it needs to be said, this is a recommendation in general to support a direction. And I'm concerned about the conflicting plans that I see happening. Now, nature of conflict is resolution, but I feel that because of the conflict, the results of that resolution would be fewer facilities, reprioritization, extra work by city planners to change. That's, again, part of their job, but I feel that the reduction would be the result of that. I'm also concerned about no clear funding specified for various facilities we talked about, and a potential impact to the pedestrian plan. So I just wanted to say those items before we voted.
Those are good things to say. Did you have something to say, Mr. Otwell?
No.
Sorry, guys.
Well, I think you've done very thorough work, and I think it's all in the right direction. I think we're just asking for more.
Just like talking to y'all.
Yeah.
We do understand this is an opportunity once in a lifetime, so your conversation is not the only one we are having, so there are numerous interests that we're trying to balance, and we'll do our best. And at a minimum, we'll continue this conversation face-to-face with you to make sure that we are doing our due diligence.
Before we vote, could I ask staff for a question of what we're losing with this plan? Is there anything if this plan is implemented, have we lost anything? If this is it and it gets implemented just like that.
So, yes, there are a number of facilities that are on the current bicycle plan map and the downtown plan that recommend facilities. I pointed out a couple of these earlier. You've talked about Morgan Street. Again, there's some casualties associated with BRT.
Martin.
Trade-offs.
Yeah, it's all trade-offs. I think South Street was a significant change that was, as we've made now infrastructure changes and two-way conversion of South Street. This would move away from bicycle facilities along South. I believe, and I'm going off of memory at this point, there's portions of North Street as it relates to connecting from Harrington into Glenwood South that have facility designations. So from a policy perspective, what this would do is it sets a policy direction for the city. It is not the final plan. So what would happen from this is this would provide us a basis by which we would amend the comprehensive plan. And that becomes more substantive as far as from a city policy direction in terms of facility designation. So there would have to be a facility, a comprehensive plan amendment that would change the bicycle plan recommendations for downtown.
Well, what I kind of was asking, and you did a good job of answering, but what I kind of was asking is if what Elizabeth has suggested, does this mean that could never happen? She wants all the streets blue.
I mean, it's the one funding opportunity you had to do a plan, and, working in this arena, you will not get funding for a downtown transportation plan again anytime soon. You could chunk at it bit by bit.
Right.
This
I
is
think
your
the one
comprehensive plan.
change with this, though, is that these are proposing Tier 1 bike facilities, which we've never had in our downtown
I think it's
core.
great.
All we have right now are glorified car lanes.
Do we have them in
frankly.
our current plan for downtown, though?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
So how is this different than our current plan by saying we're going to have continuous low-stress separated networks in downtown? Like, that's what we say now.
For example, like West Street is considered this kind of like green corridor.
We're not
in the
supposed to
downtown
consider
master
these
plan.
streets particularly correct because they could change, and I can't read them from here anyway. So this is more just saying, like, yeah, we're going to give you great bike lanes somewhere.
Yeah, the intent of this plan, it did build off of the adopted bike master plan, but something it does on top of that is it has really thought out how does the whole network work together and create a continuous low stress connected network.
But it might not be this network. It's the idea that it's going to be a continuous whole network instead of the actual representation we have here, correct? Like because you're saying like, it doesn't really matter what streets are right now because it could all change and these are not the final details. The point is that you're going to create
I don't think we said it doesn't matter. We spent a year and a half looking at the streets and setting priorities and working with stakeholders to make sure we can develop a solid starting point as we're moving into design. So we're not saying this is just a coloring exercise. This is definitely a solid recommendation that was reviewed by the public and went through multiple revisions just to make sure that we can, as much as we know today and as much information as we have today and our overall vision for the future implementation of the projects, this is our best guess at what this looks like. So we will continue with an assumption that we are working on implementing the system. Again, if going through design we identify that certain things just are physically impossible for some reason, we just can't put it there and we need to readjust, we'll have to have this conversation, but we will never have a conversation of, you know what, we just completely, this is just to kind of give you an idea how it can get connected and to have some pretty lines. That's definitely not the intent of the plan.
Well, I don't feel comfortable voting until I can look at this on a map and I can actually like see where these lines are. Like if this is really what you think is really going to work for downtown, before I can vote to support this, I got to look at it on the map and see the names of the streets and look at Google Street View and see what we're talking about. Like,
What does y'all's project implementation schedule look like as far as your next steps, as far as when you need feedback by to move forward with your corridor implementation?
Near term is moving now, so the project is in design. The first design open house is on June 25th. Additional 2 BRT projects and associated network recommendations will be moving into design in the fall. So ideally, we would have a general understanding if you are in support of this proposal to make sure as we are moving forward with design, we can look at these components. And we've been referring to the downtown plan quite a bit as part of the New Bern. So it will be hard to advance the projects without same support as RTA provided for BRT and without that support from BPAC. So as for the timeline, it's already ongoing.
Right, and it's similar to with the BRT, we did not ask RTA or City Council or anyone to approve the cross-sections for BRT on New Bern. The corridor, what it looks like, where the stations are, none of that is designed. It really has just been identified as there will be BRT on that corridor, but the corridor hasn't been studied. So we have not studied all of these street corridors in downtown. That's the next step. So these are just identifying priority streets that need to be looked at further. And then when they're looked at in more detail, if there is an issue, like Mila said, that has to be looked at about how it could be mitigated, and what's going to happen, what's the best way around it, and what the next steps are. This is just literally looking at all of downtown from Google Street View and all the information that we have, using the downtown plan, the bike plan as a basis, what we recommended for bicycles in coordination with the BRT.
Okay. Well, I think we have a motion and we have a second, and we've had a lot of discussion. I think they've heard us loud and clear about some of our concerns. Is there any more questions or discussion before I call the vote? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
No.
nay.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We appreciate it. All righty. New business being closed, we go on to board comments.
I have a comment. I think that I would like to review, what do you call it, greenway intersections with roads. and every single one of them should have a painted crosswalk, if not one of those zigzaggy things, because we are treating our greenways as transportation throughways. I'm not sure, I don't really want to call them roads, but I guess the transportation highways of our city. And if we have a greenway that ends up crossing the road, it needs to be painted. There needs to be a protection device in the center of the road, similar to Garner Road. And we need to give people the proper facilities to safely use them to navigate our city. So I don't know if the confusion is between Parks and Rec, or we're not communicating with transportation or whatnot.
So
But
if you're referring specifically to the situation
Yes.
from the young man earlier, it's an inviting situation where he came to, but the greenway actually ends, and it's a very short stub of a greenway. So it ends right there at, is it Strickland? I believe it's on Strickland. And there's driveway curb cuts cut into the street on the other side with no houses there, if I'm not mistaken. So you sit there at the end of the greenway with a ramp down onto the road,
Is it
and
a
across the
paved
street
ramp?
you see curb cuts. What's that?
is it a paved ramp?
It is a paved ramp, so there's a ramp down there, but there's not a corresponding
facility
on the other side of the road that is an
So
official
that
sidewalk
goes back
entrance.
to
So it's not
our-
officially, the greenway does not continue.
Yeah,
It's not officially a crosswalk.
The curb cut there is actually for the park maintenance vehicles to get into the greenway to be able to work. It does have some benefit for cyclists. If you did want to come off the greenway and get onto Strickland Road as an on-road cyclist, it's a handy thing to have. But there is no receiving greenway on the other side of Strickland.
So
understand now.
more broadly, this speaks to the issues we have in our transportation network and how they are car-centric by design, and how we have a good opportunity right now with the Greenway Master Plan to really hone in on where these are issues and where they need to be solved if we want to prevent children from being hit on their way to school.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to suggest, do we put this in a committee, or do we keep talking about it as a full commission, or the Greenway planning isn't going to start until this fall. So I don't know, could we, like you said, it's sort of a park thing, and it's sort of it's an interface.
Yes.
But as an instrument for a comprehensive evaluation, that is exactly the type of tool that would be good for doing that on a citywide basis.
We also have our touch points that we've formulated with the Greenway Advisory Board.
Right.
So we can make sure that this is an emphasis of discussion.
I think this is also a good example of how you can have rules and standards that make sense on paper, but in the built environment, you're sending conflicting cues, or, and it involves the staff capacity to be able to go and see these, and to be able to deviate from standards and use common sense and think about children. So I'd like to keep this at the full committee, because I'd like this on camera.
Okay. I think that sounds like a great idea. And I'll remind everyone, it was my friend who was hit in the crosswalk crossing a greenway.
It's not a one-off incident.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is an ongoing problem.
Yeah. The nice thing is, if there's paint on the ground, there's more litigation. That's the thing.
Well, there's the intent.
Well,
that
if
that's
there's
crossing.
a striped
Exactly.
crosswalk, you have the law on your side.
Exactly. So that's,
Hopefully.
technically, yes.
Right.
There's litigation.
Any
So-
other board comment? We are going to continue to talk about that one.
I had one thing. I already referred this to the right departments in Raleigh, but this came up during investigation of an event we did with Oaks and Spokes during the Bike to Movie. Found out that there's a complete lack of crosswalks and pedestrian signals at the corner of New Bern and King Charles. And that affects people going over to the Alamo Draft House and Family Dollar and some things
There
like
was somebody
that.
killed, a pedestrian killed at that intersection a few years back.
I'm not surprised, because there is no pedestrian markings at all. And I also talked to some residents of the area who said that they've had fear of that intersection for a long time. I would think that there'd be a need for the residents to go to that shopping facility, as well as people bicycling to go see the movie. So I've referred that to Paul and to the traffic planners to see if this is part of the New Bern corridor improvements. That's great. If it's not, we need to get it on the.
It is part of the scope of that project.
Good. Well, then, thank you very much for confirming that. And I do think it's something I wanted to say publicly, because some citizens had weighed in on it.
And implementation with that begins when?
That's part of the BRT.
Part of the
That's part of the sidewalk
Oh, great.
project that we have underway.
Sooner.
I'm trying to, if it's not under construction, it's imminent.
That includes crosswalks at
Yes.
St. Charles and
Not under construction.
New Bern? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's not under construction.
There's flags out.
Any other board comments? Pierre, did I see you leaning in? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I have a brief comment about the downtown transportation plan and just plans in general and how we can best be involved in project scoping. That might be too in the weeds for a commission, but I think we had 3 very capable consultants in front of us tonight, and I'm disappointed with the results. And it occurs to me that it might be because of how this project is scoped and what is in scope and out of scope. Why aren't we having conversations about roads and which mode has priority? It just feels very much like a BRT plan that had the rest of the modes tacked on at the end. One of them wasn't even in their fee. And so that's frustrating to me, and I want to see if there's a way that we can get ahead of this issue in the future. Yeah. I mean, that might be with like a greenway plan, comprehensive greenway plans, or I know we have the pedestrian plan coming up.
Okay. I don't hear any recommendations, but we'll continue to talk about that one. Pierre, did you have something? Earlier I saw you leaning forward. All right. Any other board comments? We'll move on to announcements, upcoming events. Bike month's over.
Well done.
We have an open house tomorrow at the Harrison Street Cycle Track at State of Beer from 4 to 6.
That's right.
You just got to get in the minutes. So we do have a open house for the Harrington Street Cycle Track tomorrow from 4 to 6 at State of Beer. That wasn't intentional. There just weren't very many venues allowing us to use free space in the corridor itself. HQ was booked already, and they were tight on space. That was our first choice.
Okay. Any other events?
I guess I should add prior, there will be also a panel discussion engaging the business community on the importance of Tier 1 bike facilities and how people-oriented mobility is a necessary component of a vibrant downtown community.
And when is that?
From 3 to 4 at HQ Raleigh.
And as you heard our consultant team mention, we have our first BRT project meeting for the New Bern Avenue corridor. That is from 4 to 7 on Tuesday, June 25th, and that's at Martin Street Baptist Church.
Okay. Might be a good idea for us to be looking into these meetings for that project. Anything else? Upcoming events? The next confirmation of the next BPAC meeting is Monday, July 15th at 6 p.m. in this very council chambers. If there is nothing else, I will call the meeting adjourned.